Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our Zobrio University webinar on Financial Edge AP 1099 invoicing. We'll be starting in about a minute. Just some housekeeping. If you have any questions at any time during the webinar, please feel free to use the chat button. It is located at the bottom of your screen, I believe. Go ahead and type your questions there, and at the end of the webinar, we will address all comments at that time. I'm going to go ahead and turn over the presentation to Chuck Hayes, Zobrio's Director of Application Services. Chuck, I'm going to make you the host.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Cindy, and welcome everyone. And I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen here. Make sure all our technology is working correctly. Okay, just give me one more moment here just to make sure that I can see everything that I need to see. Okay, I think we're all good to go. Well, again, welcome to our session. So today we want to focus on, exactly how does the Financial Edge process 1099 eligible information within accounts payable. So we're going to take a look at the overall workflow of how the processing works, what are the components. Then we'll do an example of actually, okay, we call it automating the information, but once I have all these pieces in place, how can I just go ahead and do my normal invoice entry and let the system help me by populating the 1099 information? And then how does that flow on through the payments and everything else? And then we'll conclude by looking at the reporting itself. As far as the processing workflow goes, we're going to go ahead and, pardon me, there's a message that popped up on my screen that is in the way here. Sorry, just one second here. We had someone who was having trouble getting the meeting. I think I'm okay now. But as far as the overall workflow, we're going to look at this basically a couple times. We're going to talk first conceptually about, okay, how is it that the system stores the information and what are the different names for the pieces and all that kind of stuff. Then we're going to look at some existing activity that already used these setups, so you can kind of cement in your mind, oh, okay, that's where these pieces are stored. This is what they're called. Then I will actually do an example and go through the process, and you'll see from start to finish exactly how everything flows through the system. So there are some vendor setup pieces that we'll look at in just a moment, and they're technically optional, but they help you with this whole idea of automating the workflow. We'll look at, okay, when I'm doing invoice entry, exactly where is the 1099 information stored? And if I did the vendor setup correctly, exactly how does that come over from the vendor record? When I do payment processing, okay, well, so yeah, I understand that 1099s mean that I actually paid the person. It's not just that I created an invoice. So how exactly does the payment help with that process, or how does the system know about all that? And then we have this issue of what are called vendor adjustments. So conceptually, what they're referring to is an increase or decrease to the overall total for the calendar year. So that begs the question, well, why would I need that? So there are a couple different examples of scenarios where that might make sense. And again, we will look at functionally how to do this, but conceptually, you might have a situation where we have some customers who say converted to the Financial Edge sometime during the calendar year. So there are several months that Financial Edge has no knowledge of what happened as far as 1099 information is concerned in, say, another financial system. So you can add an adjustment to increase the total for the year. Just like, okay, well, we did $500 in our other system, just add that into the annual total when the reports and forms are issued. Another idea would be, well, what if we paid a vendor? We didn't know it was supposed to be 1099 information because they didn't do the right forms or whatever. You know how those scenarios go. But you find out after the fact. And once you verify that an invoice you paid should have had 1099 information stored in it. You can't do it after it's been paid. You have to start all over again. You can just add an adjustment to also increase the annual total. And then kind of a third example, I think I said two, but I'll do throw in a third one. Let's say that you paid a vendor, and I'll pick an amount like $1,000. And the vendor comes back and says, hey, by the way, on my invoice, I mentioned to you that $250 of that $1,000 was actually for parts. And you missed that when you did the total. You assumed all 1,000 was 1099 eligible. So that's an example where you need to lower the overall total. Well, again, once you've paid them, you create an adjustment, but you can do negative numbers, which is really kind of cool. So we'll take a look at that functionally. And then lastly, we have in the whole workflow, the 1099 reports is actually one, but you can run that at any time during the year just to see where things stand. And then there's the integration with the third party called Atrix, where you can, in January of next year, run the 1099 forms. And we have a service where we can partner with you and we help you with that whole process and evaluating everything. So conceptually, it starts with the invoice, flows through the payments. You can do adjustments to increase or decrease the annual total, and then you've got the reporting in the form. Let's go through that same concept again, but let's look at some existing records and look at the settings for each of these pieces. Then we'll put it all together in an actual example and see if we have any questions. It's pretty straightforward once you get the hang of it. So I'm going to use a particular vendor example here. So DL Landscaping has already been set up in my little sample database to do 1099 information. So you'll notice that for the vendor setup, we have a checkbox and 1099 distribution information. So what exactly is that and where is it located? So I'm going to start with the button in the lower left called 1099 distribution. And by the way, even though that is a button, you can also access that information from the vendor menu under 1099 default distribution. So notice there's a difference in terminology, but they're both the same thing. So this 1099 distribution in the vendor record, again, vendor record, not the invoice. In the vendor record, it's a starting point. It's a default. It's what you normally expect to happen with this vendor. Right now, it doesn't mean anything for reporting because it's just letting us know that, oh, by the way, this is a box 7 1099 vendor. And normally, all of their invoices are attributed to 1099 activity. This is the magic information that can copy into a new invoice, serving as both a reminder, oh, by the way, this is supposed to be a 1099 vendor, but also save you some data entry time. So the main functional purpose for having this default distribution is to assist you in that workflow we talked about earlier when you're adding new invoices. A second piece of this setup in the vendor is this little checkbox in the lower left, 1099 vendor question mark. It's a good best practice to always enable the checkbox if you have the right information for this vendor and they are supposed to normally be a 1099 vendor. Strictly speaking, functionally, it doesn't really do anything. I mean, it does not get in the way of the report working correctly if my invoices have the right information. So it's not required to make reporting and forms work correctly. But it is a best practice because then it's easy to pull out, say, with a query or things like that, who is a 1099 vendor or supposed to be, and then make sure that you've got their tax ID on file and that type of thing. So that does raise a separate question. It's more about your business practices, but it's a good idea to make sure that the vendor files the appropriate forms with you, that you keep those on file, you set up the record accordingly, and then periodically check to make sure that the records are still correct. So again, from the vendor record standpoint, the big pieces for the workflow are the 1099 default distribution and then the checkbox that they are a vendor. And of course, you have to have the tax ID in order to correctly file the forms at the end of the year. So technically that is part of the setup, but that's like a separate piece that just stays in the vendor record. So that's what happens at the vendor record level. Now let's look at an example of an invoice for the same vendor. And so I mentioned on this little grid that there is a separate 1099 distribution in the invoice. And that puts us closer to the reports working correctly, but still not yet there. So I'm going to open up this particular invoice. and it was for lawn care. And you'll notice on the right-hand side, a little bit past the middle, there's another 1099 distribution button. Well, this is the one that we really need to pay attention to when it comes to the whole workflow, because this is the starting point of making sure that the invoice is entered correctly. So the checkbox means there's something behind the information in the button. And in this case, you'll see the box 7, and it's the full dollar amount that came from the invoice. It's yellowed out because right now the invoice has been paid, so I wouldn't have the option to edit it. When we circle back and I create a brand new invoice, then you'll see how we could make changes while we're doing the original invoice entry. So the invoice needs to have the 1099 information in it like you see here. Then what happens when you pay the invoice, this is where it really matters. And there's nothing you can do if you haven't populated the invoice. So they both matter. You've got to get the invoice right as far as the information goes. Then that copies into the payment record. And I'll explain why, but let me show you where it happens. So once you pay the invoice, and here this is paid by computer check, I'll open up the payment record. The only way to look at what happens with the 1099 information as far as the payment is concerned is from the payment menu at the top. You'll see there's an option called 1099 distribution. And this verifies that the $500 distribution that was in the invoice did copy over correctly to the payment. So that also raises the question of, well, why does it matter? Well, let's just circle back for a second to the IRS regulations. And obviously, we are not here serving as IRS representatives or tax attorneys or accountants in that regard. But the regulations are very clear that you don't include the dollar amount unless it's been paid to the vendor in the calendar year that you're reporting. It's not when you create the invoice or date the invoice, it's the date of the payment that matters. So Financial Edge has to take that into consideration. So what it does is it copies the invoice distribution into the payment. But there's also a potential additional wrinkle to this, which is another reason why the payment really matters for reporting purposes. Let's suppose that the 1099 vendor allows you to take an early payment discount, like 1.5% if you pay within 10 days. Now, not everybody does that, but let's pretend they do. So I started off with a $500 invoice, and if I take advantage of that 1.5% discount, then I'm going to have a few dollars taken off the total. I'm not going to pay him $500. So when you do the payment process, and if there is the potential for a discount and if you meet the right date requirement, then the amount that's copied into the payment for 1099 purposes will be the actual amount you paid. In this case, it would be lower than $500. So that's why the payment, another reason why the payment really matters. So when you run a report in Financial Edge, which again we'll look at eventually, but when you run a report in Financial Edge or you run the Atrix forms, those are looking at the payment record to find the total. So again, just to recap, you enter the 1099 information in the invoice, you pay the invoice, and then it's considered eligible for reporting or form purposes. All right, again, we'll create an example a little bit. So we talked about the invoice places and the payment places. Let's take a look at where those adjustments are stored. And then again, we'll create an example and show you how it all works. But back to the vendor record in the lower left corner where we saw the button for the 1099 distribution, you notice there's also a 1099 adjustment button. Now, this particular button will be included in reports, assuming you use the correct dates for the right year, but I'll be able to either increase or decrease the annual total for this vendor by adding a vendor adjustment. And all that really matters is the date. In fact, if you had a situation with a conversion where I had like 4 payments to this vendor that needed to be included, you could just do one entry for whatever the date is, or you could put all 4 in. The system doesn't really care. But so the adjustments at the vendor level will be added to the report based on the dates that you select. And then lastly, we have the 1099 reports and forms. So there's one report specifically designed for that. Again, we will take a look at it once we create a new example. But in reports, under vendor reports, you'll see there is a 1099 activity report. We have a couple different examples set up here. We'll look at one of those. And that will show you dollar total for each box per vendor. And that's to help verify. So it's a good practice to run that during the course of the year. And then the Atrix integration is handled in forms. That's a little bit beyond what we do here today to actually generate the forms. But you would create one of these files and then go through a process with the Atrix integration. And then that would actually go ahead and create the 1099 forms that you would then send to the vendor or electronically transmit. So now let's go ahead and circle back and create an example with this vendor where we look at all these settings again, but we kind of watch them flow through the system. So I'll just use my DL landscaping example. Currently, the activity is a little bit older in the sample database, so it's kind of helpful. So let's just review the settings. We've got a 1099 default distribution for box 7. It's set to use all 100% of our invoice. We'll take a look at that. So I'm going to go to the Activity tab. I'm just going to start a new invoice, and I'll make up a few numbers here. So let's pretend that they don't do a lot with their own numbering system. And let's say that this happened earlier this week. So I'll do the 22nd. Okay, so I'll make up a number for them. And I'll use today's date. By the way, a couple data entry tips that I always like to throw in during these demonstrations. But when you're entering a date in Financial Ed, you don't have to type all the digits. So if it's the current month and the current year, I'm going to use Monday's date, 22nd, you can just type in the day number and tab out, and voila. Okay, so we'll just stick with the lawn care example. That grass grows like crazy. And again, I'll do a slightly different amount just to show the variation. So let's pretend that this one, we did a little extra mulching or something. I'll bump it up to $750. Now, once I go ahead and add in the invoice amount, then when I look at the 1099 distribution, everything will work correctly. Notice there is a checkbox. So the box 7 information copied over. The default said 100%, so it took 100% of my invoice amount. If I switch to percent, you'll see that that's the case. But I recommend looking at it after you enter the dollar amount, because otherwise, if there were no dollar amount, then nothing would show up here. But this does bring up the point that I can alter the 1099 distribution. Now, logically, I can't make it higher than the dollar amount of the invoice. So the system will not allow you to game the system and give someone eventually, you know, not that people want to necessarily show more income because they have to pay more taxes, but you can't make the total of the distribution for the 1099 higher than the total amount of the invoice. I can't go above $750, but I could put in a lower amount. So I could do $500 if some of this were parts or something like that. So you can capture that difference at this point. I'll leave it as the 100% and show you that it, you know, after the fact, what if I messed up? That's where that vendor adjustment can come into play. So you want to make sure that you capture the 1099 information using those vendor defaults. You will be able to edit it or add it or modify it up until the point of paying the invoice. This particular vendor also has a default general ledger distribution, as they need a little data entry in there. And right now, we have not yet paid the invoice. So again, copies from the vendor record. I verify the information. I'm good to go. I'll save and close. I've also color-coded my view of the vendor information to show red, and also you can show the last check number. Let me just briefly mention those because those are not normally turned on by default. So I do like to point those out as well. The last check number is an additional column that you can do as a one-time setting change to your view of Financial Edge. So just open up any vendor record, just open up one so the system remembers your setting, do a right click on the Activity tab and you'll see columns. And I can bring over the last check number. It's normally on the left-hand side to start. Just use the arrows to move it to the right, and I just keep it in the last placeholder. And the color coding is related to a section called the Legends inside the user options. You can also do a right click and go to that. This just takes me into the user options. but I'll be able to go ahead and set for invoice activity everything that's not the word paid. I can make red, depending on how you use the system. I can see partially paid or invoices that haven't gone through the status changes with approved or pending. And that's how I end up with that bill, the red showing up. So it's kind of fun. All right, so I've got the invoice ready to go. Now, of course, I have to pay the invoice in order for a report to pick up the fact that I had this activity during the course of calendar year 2019. So let me just quickly pay this invoice. I've got a PDF printer set up, so this should go pretty quickly. So of course, we do that from banks, print checks, all that kind of stuff. I do have some other unpaid invoices here. I'm just going to ignore those. So on the invoices tab, I'm going to deselect all. So let's take a look here and look at there we go, BL Landscaping. So I'll just pay this one invoice. We'll get a little pop-up here from my PDF printer. Let's just put that on my desktop. I'm not going to bother with naming conventions and all that. All right, so got the check printed, and right now I don't really care so much about that. I'm more interested in the fact that I need to have that 1099 information for my report. So let's go back to our vendor for a moment. Now my invoice is back to Blackprint. So this is the invoice that I just paid. So if I go to the Payments and Credits tab, you'll see that there is a new check. And if I look at the Payment menu, the 1099 distribution is intact in the payment record. Now at this point, I mean, if you just think about it, I can't do any more editing because the only place I can edit is in the invoice. And once I pay the invoice, everything is locked. I'd have to void the payment and then start over again, which isn't necessarily a good idea because, you know, if I already paid them and I cash the check, I should not be voiding the check. So that's where the vendor adjustments come into play. So let's just close the loop here and take a look at that. So I'm going to go ahead and close the invoice. So back on the vendor tab, I've got the 1099 adjustment information. So let's assume, for argument's sake, that of that $750, $50 of that was maybe for some mulch or some supplies or something like that. So I'll just use today's date because I forgot to lower it to 700. I'll still use box 7. And the state doesn't necessarily matter where you are, but this is where I can do a negative number. I kind of like to use this example because it's kind of unusual in FE to use negative numbers. So I can do a negative $50, which means that we'll only have $700. Okay. So now that I've taken care of that, let's take a look for a moment. I'll throw in a bonus feature. In the Activity tab, there is a summary button at the top. And in the upper left corner of the summary, I can do a summary of 1099 activity. And one of the issues with this summary is it won't include the vendor adjustments. I just want to point that out. That's where the report really matters. But it is a quick way to see what's going on for the regular things that you're doing, which is why I didn't include it in the slides, but call it a bonus feature. All right, so I've done my invoice. I've paid it. I've made an adjustment. Let's take a look at the report. So again, that was under reports, vendor reports. Now I've got one already preset for this year, so I don't have to keep changing the date. Let's just look at a few settings, though, that I think are worth pointing out. Obviously, I want to look at this calendar year, but take a look at the checkboxes on this General tab. They include vendors with 1099 activity that are not marked as 1099 vendors. So that refers to the checkbox on the vendor tab that says it's a 1099 vendor. And this reinforces the fact that I said earlier, yes, as a best practice, you should check that box. But if for some reason you failed to do that, the report can be run and overlook the fact that you weren't consistent in your setup, which is why I said earlier that technically it's not fully required, but it is a good practice. And then the second checkbox, and this is a business decision, but as you know, the IRS has a threshold before which you don't have to send a form to somebody. I think it's currently $600. But it's probably a good idea to run the report to show everything that's on the record, even those that are below the 600, just so you're aware that when you go at the end of the year to do the forms, you'll know which ones you're excluding from the process. So I'll leave that checkbox in place. Now, technically, you could also use the third checkbox, include vendors and no activity, but I don't want to do that because then I got all these vendors showing up and I don't care about them. I just want the folks that are that have activity, if you will. I will mention a side note sometimes that comes up because as you saw from the checkboxes, there was no option that said restrict this report to vendors that have the 1099 checkbox. That's not an option. And that brings up a larger issue with reports that I'll just go ahead and mention in this context. So what do you do when you have a report? So let's pretend that I wanted to have this report show every 1099 vendor. Not every vendor, which is what that checkbox would have done. Every vendor that had no activity. I don't want to see every vendor. I just want to see the 1099 vendors. And there's no checkbox that says, just show me the 1099 vendors. So that can happen on reports all over the place in Financial Edge. So the rule of thumb is, if you do not see an option to restrict the report the way you want, especially on the filters tab, there's no filter for the 1099 checkbox is checked, then you create a query. Now, queries are beyond what we're talking about today. But if I did have a query set up of 1099 vendors, which by the way, I happen to have, I just want to show you how you would add the query. But again, we'll have another conversation in another webinar about how to create a query. But you'll notice I can switch from all to selected for vendors, and there is an option to use a query. Then I could browse out and take a look at the queries that are available. And I just so happen to have a 1099 query, and it's looking for vendors where the checkbox is checked to make them a 1099 vendor. I'm not going to use it right now, but I do want to point out it would be a way to make this report show all of those vendors that you think could have that information, and then also report within that universe the ones that actually do have total. The format tab is pretty straightforward. It's just page numbers and all that kind of stuff. We always want to look at the detail. If you don't care about the state, you could just ignore that. And it defaults to sorting by vendor. You can't really change that. So let's take a look at the preview. And I'm going to go ahead and show you one more. Well, actually, no, I'm pretty much finished with the settings. But if we take a look at this, I set this up for this year. And sure enough, and notice the total on the right. It's $700. Not $750. So that does illustrate that the report is looking at both the invoice activity total from the sorry, I said that wrong. The payment total that was copied from the invoice and the vendor adjustments, assuming they're both dated in the same calendar year. So that's how I end up with my $700. And then if I were to run the Atrix forms, again, they would, obviously the form for 2019 doesn't exist yet, but if I, when I get to January and run those, then Atrix will pull the same information that's on the report. So you can run this activity report before you do the forms and everything should match. So that brings us to the conclusion of our little discussion and demonstration of 1099 information. Just a couple of summary comments. We do like to talk about this around this time of the year, around the first quarter or so of the year, because we don't want you to get all the way to November or December and then realize you haven't been doing it correctly in the invoices or monitoring things or setting up the vendors. And then you have to go back and figure everything out and do all these adjustments. So by trying to at least address it now, you can make sure that everything is up to date and that going forward, you wouldn't have any, shall we say, surprises. The other thing that I would like to point out is that we often have customers who say, you know what, we never really got this set up to our satisfaction. So can you help us with that? And certainly our client care agreements for when you have a brief question, a regular support question, but this is kind of outside that. So we could put together a package for you somewhere around 4 to 6 hours. That's pretty typical. And, we can make it time and materials. So how much does it actually take? But we can do prepaid assist. And then We'll go through a very methodical process of using query and pass. We'll review all your current setups, make sure we can pull out of what's actually in there. You know, do you have all the right vendors? Like we can help you with, you have a list of forms, people that have forms, we can match that up. Then we can narrow it down to where do you not have the ID number in the system. All that stuff we can actually globally add or import the default distributions, help you with that. And then we can get you going with vendor adjustments through the point of when we work with you. And then do just a little refresher training of how to get it in there. But that way you can make sure that you're fully up to date and you don't have to worry about it again, and just make sure you're doing it as you're entering the invoices. And our salesperson, Matt, can certainly help you with that. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Cindy. Let me go ahead and stop sharing. I'll let Cindy go ahead and take over, and we can go from there.
Thank you, Chuck. I wanted to go ahead and open it up to everybody. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to use the Zoom chat to send us a quick question. Or you can just jump on, unmute your phone, and also ask a question live. Questions, anyone? Going once? Going twice? Okay. Thanks everyone for attending our webinar. We do have a recording of the webinar. We will post it on our website. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to call the 800 number listed on the screen. And thanks again for joining us. Stay tuned.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.